I've had a role in this project for the last 2 years now as the external evaluator. So I was appointed by the project coordination team to be the external evaluator on this project, and in fact actually on the previous project that they also ran on full cooperation, zero violence. So I've been coming to Malta for the last 3 years now, thanks to Katja. Anyway, just to remind you of a couple of other things. If you haven't registered already, can you please remember to do that outside, because they need that for the EU funding thingy. The other thing is this event is being videoed, so if anybody doesn't want themselves to be on camera, if you want to stay sitting behind the camera, that's how you can stay out of shot. And then in your bags there is an evaluation sheet, and we'd like you to fill that in as well. Again, this is part of the EU stuff, but it's also part for my job to see how you found this last event. So this is the second last event of the programme. This week the Malta Girl Guides are running their final festival, as it was to be called, but now the festival is going to have to be online, obviously, and that's happening tomorrow. And then the project is coming to its close. So this final conference is actually about then hearing of the experience of the different project partners over the time, and also then in particular hearing the results of the research that was done as a key part of the project. But I'll let Andriana explain all that when that time comes. So we're going to kick off with a video which explains the project a little bit more.
Kull sena s-servizz tal-vjolenza domestika fl-Aġenzija Appoġġ jilqa' fuq minn 400 każ ġdid ta' vjolenza domestika. Il-maġġoranza tal-vittmi huma nisa, però s-servizzi tagħna huma miftuħin għal kulħadd, irrispettivament mill-ġeneru, l-orjentazzjoni sesswali, l-età, ir-razza, ir-reliġjon u l-abilità. Jeżistu wkoll servizzi għat-tfal tal-vittmi kif ukoll għall-aggressuri.
It-taqsim mas-sapport tal-vittmi fil-Pulizija ta' Malta tassisti lill-vittmi ta' kriminalità u lill-familji tagħhom. Tipprovdi sapport adekwat sabiex jonqos l-istress emozjonali u psikoloġiku fuq il-vittmi. B'hekk il-Pulizija tkun tista' tassigura id-drittijiet bażiċi tal-vittmi skont il-liġi.
Waqqaf il-vjolenza u fittex l-għajnuna billi tagħmel rapport lill-Pulizija jew iċċempel 179.
Il-vjolenza hija għażla.
Għalhekk naħdmu flimkien u ngħidu le għall-vjolenza.
I explained that wrong. Obviously, that was part of one of the videos in terms of the awareness raising campaign, which is a big focus of what this whole project was to raise awareness in different target groups of people who do experience intimate partner violence or violence and bullying in general in terms of gender-based violence. We now have a video welcome message from Dr. Edward Zamet-Lewis, the Minister for Justice, Equality and Governance.
As the Minister responsible for equality, it is my pleasure to address this seminar intended to continue breaking the cycle of violence. This project, which is co-financed by the European Union Rights, Equality and Citizenship Funding Programme and builds on the full cooperation Zero Violence project, will be complementing Malta's strategy to implement an important treaty, the Istanbul Convention. The aim of this project is to provide the necessary help to vulnerable women or those who are most at risk of suffering violence of all kinds, economic, psychological, sexual or physical. This incorporates various activities. Amongst them, during 2018 and early 2019, information sessions and one-to-one sessions were held with groups of women who are more susceptible to domestic violence. In addition, mentoring and one-to-one sessions were held with victims of domestic violence, where training was given on how to detect the first symptoms of domestic violence, support services that are available for help as well as self-defense techniques. An awareness-raising campaign was also held for the public, as well as information sessions with staff working in government departments and the Chamber of Advocates to raise awareness on the subject. We are seeking to work relentlessly to break the cycle of violence. This will not only by implementing an important legal regime in Malta and help the victims and the most vulnerable, but also by changing mentalities, not only of those affected, of the victims, but also of the perpetrators and of society as a whole. Recently, I have signed a memorandum of understanding between Appoġġ, the Maltese Police Force, and the FSWS. This will ensure a holistic approach when dealing with victims of domestic violence and total synergy at government level. During the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, I offered free legal service to all victims of domestic violence 24/7, with the engagement of lawyers specialized in the sector. I can assure you of my commitment, my determination to continue working in order to break the cycle in an effective manner. We can do it together.
Okay, I was just going to say thank you to him, and then I realized he's not in the room. Anyway, okay, so we have two other speakers who are going to address us to kind of kick us off. So we have Andriana Frigieri, the Commissioner on Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence.
So good morning. Good morning, everyone. I am going to thank the Minister and the Parliamentary Secretary for their commitment and constant support to this worthy cause, just in time. Also, all my colleagues, board members, and also my thanks go to the European Rights, Equality and Citizenship Funding Programme. Special thanks to all of you for being here today and for the invaluable work that you do for our society in our endeavors to alleviate human suffering caused by violence and abuse. Much work is being done. Our initiatives are proving effective, as can be seen by the increased use of services set up for the benefit of the public. Strengthened information campaigns that seek to educate the public and express solidarity with those experiencing violence and abuse, as well as targeted services to offer more help and support, especially to those who, because of difficult living conditions, may not otherwise have access to them. The aim of this project has been to provide the necessary help to vulnerable women or those who are more at risk of suffering of all kinds, psychologically, economically, sexually, or physically. Indeed, domestic violence continues to be a scourge. It continues to challenge us every day. Our instinctive response to this human plight is to devise more and different ways to prevent such episodes from occurring. This is certainly an important and necessary initiative. But we also need to delve into the various realities of those caught up in this vicious and toxic cycle of violence in order to help them at the particular stage they find themselves in. This can be aided by qualitative research that seeks to understand the life world of the people going through this harrowing experience, because violence and abuse do not happen in a vacuum. A finding that struck me in the discussion on violence outlined in the research performed by Dr. Dibben and her colleagues was that the young people and also adults who participated in the research believe that the stereotypes related to men and women and relationships are the biggest issues in society today. They felt that there needs to be a change in mentality because violence is normalized in certain households, which then leads to a state of affairs where neither victims nor perpetrators are aware that their behavior is harming others around them. This struck me because of its familiarity, especially from my long experience of working with youth and their families in the education system. Many of us have been brought up in such households, and many of us still are living in such conditions. We cannot deny that very often what we see at the surface is a symptom of the greater dynamic at work in the person's private life. Domestic violence is a systemic phenomenon in this sense. I believe we can gain a better understanding and be more effective if we take this idea into consideration. It's not unlike the physical ailment that manifests itself as a result of a patient's lifestyle. I believe that this systemic approach can make us more effective in our endeavors to heal the broken and the wounded and to prevent the incidence of violence and abuse. This is what the Breaking the Cycle of Violence project has set out to do by focusing on the underlying human theme in incidents of violence and on finding ways of applying innovative and appropriate interventions in ways that cross culture, race, gender, and convention. 1 in 3 women have experienced some form of physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. We know that in situations of armed conflict, these rates are far higher. Conflict-related humanitarian crises trigger patterns of sexual violence, including rape, trafficking, and forced marriages. Men and boys are also harmed, but women and girls are particularly exposed. We need to understand not only the needs and vulnerabilities of girls and women, we also need to understand the needs and vulnerabilities of boys and men and develop our ability to work with men in these situations. We have to recognize the complexities and act accordingly. If we are to end gender-based violence, the perpetrators must be brought to justice. And just as important as justice is the issue of rehabilitation. It is key to work with men so that they come to realize what drives their own violence, so that their children are not exposed to the same attitudes and experiences that they were, so that it becomes possible to end the cycle of violence. We know from research that the main drivers of violence against women are deep-rooted gender inequalities. Pervasive gender norms and unequal power relations create the conditions in which violence against women is tolerated and even, in some cases, accepted. Understanding the dynamics of power and culture is key to changing these attitudes and to engaging men as agents of change. Men who have worked towards an equal and fair society must be empowered and lead by example to break situations of ongoing violence. To end gender-based violence, we must work with whole communities, women and men, girls and boys. Let's keep up the momentum. Our invaluable work, our commitment, our sensitivity towards the suffering of others, and our compassion. Together, we can make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And indeed, we have a saying in Ireland, it's in Irish, but the translation is, our strength is together. So I totally can agree with what you were just finishing your comments with. Thank you very much. And now we have an address by the Honourable Rosianna Kuchjar. Hope I say that all right. It'll do. I'm very sorry. While I've been here a lot, I never learned Maltese. Anyway, the Parliamentary Secretary for Equality and Reforms. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Commissioner. May I also congratulate you for your sterling work. Dear guests, I thank you first and foremost for inviting me to address you all at this final conference, Breaking the Cycle of Violence. Despite many positive and significant achievements in policies and practices, domestic violence remains widespread at all levels of society and in all countries of the world. Statistics show us that the majority of victims of domestic violence are women. Whilst saying this, we have also to bear in mind all the time that there are also men who are experiencing domestic violence, and also individuals within same-sex couples, and also in the elderly. We need to keep in mind that perpetrators need also professional help, just as the victims of domestic violence should be given shelter and professional help so that they are not exposed to threats or any other form of aggression. And it's up to us to ensure that we offer the necessary help for both. This government has been working tirelessly in the fight against domestic violence. This year alone, we've started giving free legal aid service through a pool of expert lawyers in the sector, whilst also, together with the Ministry for Home Affairs, we are working on having a specialized unit within the police force, which will be relating to domestic violence. Moreover, selected police officers are now receiving specialized training to handle cases of domestic violence with the necessary empathy and sensitivity. A simulator has been purchased for all purpose of enhancing the education and training program of specialized police officers who will be working also in the newly set up domestic violence unit. I know that a lot has been done through this project, from one-to-one sessions with female migrants, women from the LGBTIQ community and women with disability, etc. And for this, I say well done and thank you for your hard work and commitment in fighting this everlasting war. The public, along with domestic abuse victims, need to know that there is a light at the end of the tunnel. The embarrassment associated with being an abuse victim and acknowledgement are small hurdles to overcome when lives are at stake. Much has been accomplished, but much more can be done. Vigorous debate, no doubt, will linger on just what is an appropriate response to domestic violence. As long as we all agree, a behavioral shift is absolutely necessary for any hope for long-term success. Like anything else in life, the ability and willingness for success lies within each of us. Violence will not stop until we have a cultural shift in our attitudes to gender power and violence. The struggle is enormous, but it also reveals that those concerned with domestic violence do not stand alone. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, Madam Secretary. I'm changing your jobs. I don't know whether you want to swap or not, but okay. So thank you very much. That kind of sets the scene for the context of the project. And now we have Katja Una, from the Commission on Gender-Based Violence, to give us an overview of the project objectives and the results achieved. Thanks, Katja.
Good morning and thank you all for coming. I'd like to give you a very brief overview of the deliverables of this project because it's been going on for the past 2.5 years. As you know, we've taken quite a bit of commitment in ensuring that we continue to raise the awareness at a national level. So as you can see from my first slide, the project was originally 36 months long. However, we've managed to have an extension of another 6 months considering that COVID came about and we couldn't implement certain deliverables. So we've extended the project till the end of this year. It was originally, till the end of June of this year. As you know, it's been funded by the Rights, Equality and Citizenship Programme of the EU Commission, and the total budget for this project was 350,000 with 80% EU funds and 20 on national funds. So what was the objective of this project? It aimed to identify the behaviors and attitudes towards violence in targeted groups. and the need to break the cycle of violence by changing behaviors contributing to violence against women, gender stereotypes, inequalities, and then also to promote gender equality, something which our ministry, as Ministry for Equality, drives through in our work as well. Who were the partners in this project? We had quite a number of partners. Besides us as Ministry and Commission on Gender-Based Violence and Domestic Violence being the lead, we've had the University of Malta, who carried out the research, which will be presented later on today by Dr. Dibin. We've had the Commission for the Rights of Persons with Disability. We've had the Malta Girl Guides, who have focused their attention on raising awareness amongst Girl Guides, and also Scouts to have to raise awareness also among young men and boys. We've had the Malta Gay Rights Movement, Migrant Women Association, and also other partners have been included, such as Program SEP from Dar Alta Ġesu, Aġenzija Appoġġ, and also the Scouts, as I mentioned earlier. So quite a number of partners, all contributing towards raising awareness on this issue. We focus now on activities. We've had a launch event quite a while ago now under Minister Elena Dalli, who's now our EU Commission, at the EU Commission as a commissioner. And then we've had mentoring sessions, both with victims of violence against women and with the different target groups. And the target groups were persons with disability, women from the LGBTI community, as well as persons with disability. We've also provided online training packs, and these are available on our website, stopviolence@.gov.mt. Sorry, I've confused that. I was going to tell you our email address instead. So let me repeat the website. It's stopviolence.gov.mt. You will be able to access the online training packs absolutely for free and disseminate as you deem fit. The Malta Girl Guides organized a Train the Trainer weekend with its young adults in a view to raise awareness, but also to give them the necessary skills to be able to work with younger girl guides and obviously disseminate further information on how to detect signs of violence and also to build healthy relationships, which I think is very, very important. We've had also the Youth Ambassadors Weekend, information sessions with HR persons, advocates, and the public service employees. And as you know as well, we've had research on 2 levels, quite an interesting research carried out by the University of Malta, as well as a telephone survey to assess pre-awareness raising campaign activities and post-awareness raising activities. The aim of the telephone research was to gain a better understanding of whether there has been a shift in behavior when reporting or detecting violence against women and domestic violence. And we've had various awareness-raising campaigns all throughout the timeline of the project, including earlier this year to target awareness-raising during the lockdown of the pandemic. So as I said, the launch event, we've managed to slot in a photo there for you as well, was launched by the ex-minister, Dr. Elena Dalli. Back then, the project belonged to the Human Rights and Integration Directorate and then moved nicely with me when I joined the Commission to be able to implement it according, obviously, in line with the strategy. So there we are. And what else can I tell you? Sessions. Let me give you some statistics. So we've had a total of 16 information sessions, 16 mentoring sessions, 46 one-to-one sessions, and 4 award ceremonies. Why was it important for us to categorize such sessions? we thought that targeting the specific needs of these vulnerable groups would ensure that we can raise awareness according to their vulnerability. As you know, research shows that among vulnerable groups, particularly persons with disability, LBTI, and also migrant women, there is a higher risk due to the intersectional element, okay, of these individuals. So besides giving them the opportunity to work in a group together, we've also provided one-to-one sessions so that individuals can feel more comfortable and at ease talking about maybe their experiences of abuse or whether they consider their vulnerability as hindering them from maybe accessing work or being skilled enough to enter the labor market, for example, or to feel part of society as a whole because of this type of inequality, okay? So we've also in total targeted 12 victims of violence, 9 migrant women, 10 LBTI women, and 15 women with disability. So the online training packs, as I mentioned earlier, were carried out by the various group leaders, and you can find the training packs online, and they target the victims of domestic violence, women with disability, LBTI women, and migrant women. So as you can see, due to the different vulnerability and group, we didn't use one training pack for all because we believe that each group needed specific and particular attention. We did not use the one-size-fits-all model, which I think is very, very important. As much as we're aware that there is some common ground between all groups, we preferred obviously to focus on the particular needs. Okay. So we've had the Train the Trainer weekend with a total of 29 leaders. I can see Joyce smiling from up here. That confirms the success, right, Joyce, of this training weekend. All the participants had a really good time, but besides, obviously, we equipped them with the necessary skills to be able to continue their work. And we've also targeted 49 youth ambassadors, which I think is such a success because even our commissioner mentioned how important it is to target the younger generation, okay? The need to have healthier relationships and also to detect violence at an earlier stage. So I think that was also a success in itself. We will be able to hear more about that during the panel discussion. And the information sessions, we've had 4 human resource sessions, 1 human resource session also in Gozo, 1 Chamber of Advocates session, and 4 public service employees sessions. So I think that goes to show the cross exchange of information across the different departments and entities. We didn't only focus on the younger generation. The research on the University of Malta was conducted by Dr. Dibin, Dr. Marie Briguglio, and Dr. Janice Formosa-Pac. I am very excited to hear the results, even though I've had the actual research copy since March, because originally this conference was going to take place in March, but due to COVID. So I'm really looking forward to hear the results live here with us. But besides that, we've also had the telephone surveys, as I said, pre-campaign survey to detect perceptions and behaviors of individuals, and this was carried out with 1,000 respondents, so that's quite a good number, representative number there. And the post-campaign was carried out with 1,004 respondents, and we have some basic statistics there to show us whether there has been a slight shift in behavior, and I think we can see a little bit. And some findings focused on the first action towards public act of violence against women. So if an act of violence takes place in a public space, how would people in the street respond? And here are some findings. Would they call the police? So before the actual campaign, 38% said they would call the police. After the campaign, 43% said so. So we've seen a slight change there. What about not taking any action, just not thinking that this would be my responsibility and reporting or take some kind of action? There was 26% who would say they can't be bothered and just keep walking away. Then after the campaign, our awareness raising campaign, the respondents' percentage was less. So I believe there is some kind of change. Thanks to the campaign, thanks to the different work being done by all the national entities and also the NGOs, we can see that people are starting to recognize the need to take action, because this is not a private matter, okay? We need to be responsible enough to report violence. Would people shout out if they see an act of violence in the street? 12% said no before the campaign. 13% said they would after we had the campaign. So a very small percentage there. Would people talk to the perpetrator and confront or address the issue that this is not okay? We had 9% there before the survey and 8% post-survey. So I think these statistics will help us to also inform our policies and strengthen the need to address the perpetrator as well, even as Commissioner mentioned earlier. Talk and help the victim. How many individuals out there would be willing to talk to the victim and provide assistance? 5% would said this before the survey. However, after the campaign, the number has increased. The percent has increased to 8%. So I think there's a slight change also there. And some respondents say, well, I wouldn't know what to do, and the percentage is not too high. So hopefully those few numbers who said they don't know what to do, we also need to target them during our campaigns and our work. Along the months of this project, we've also targeted awareness-raising campaigns specifically within the intranet, which is a mechanism within the different ministries. As you know, the public service is quite a large number, so we've thought that yes, it's so important to, why not raise awareness in that fora as well, which is quite an active mechanism. As you might have seen when you walked in to register, and you have some copies also in your bag, we've produced various information leaflets. They are in various languages, not only Maltese and English. However, we have Italian, Serbian, and Filipino, thus targeting the so important need to have information out there, which is in more than one language, because this reflects our society today. Should you wish copies for further dissemination, please do talk to us, to one of my colleagues, and we will be happily able to provide you with more. And last but not least, as I said, we've had a very important campaign during COVID, okay? Thanks to this project, we've managed also to reach out to women who were experiencing, well, the general public really, not only women, who were maybe experiencing or at risk of violence, and who, due to the pandemic, were locked down with their perpetrator, thus making the home anything but a safe place for them. In conclusion, what have the results been of this project? We have improved data availability. We've raised awareness all throughout the 36 months, and we've targeted to change attitudes and behaviors towards violence against women. Have we accomplished it all? Definitely not. Our work will not stop. We will continue to thrive and push through. And I thank you all for it, because you are part and parcel of this movement. Empower participants of training to speak up against violence against women. I would like to give you just a little vignette of the one-to-one sessions and the group sessions, which were carried out at Dar Al-Tajasu. I remember one of the participants said how important it is for us to give us a voice. It is liberating for us to be able to talk about our experience and not talk about our experience only for the sake of doing so because we are residing in a shelter at the moment, but because we believe that by giving us a voice, we can help others. And I think that is something which I keep in my mind on a day-to-day basis when I am working at the office. So, and the last result is ultimately to prevent gender-based violence, violence against women, and increase the rate of reporting. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. Thank you for being here. Please keep up your sterling work.
Thanks very much, Katja. That's a very comprehensive overview of what was a very complicated project. That was one of the things when they asked me to be the external evaluator, that was one of the things that I noticed, I suppose, that there were so many strands being interwoven into this project in order to address the whole issue around awareness raising and around prevention. So that was quite a key thing, to not just focus on any one particular population, but to recognize that all sorts of different populations need awareness raising specifically targeted at them and might need particular support work as well. So it's been quite interesting noticing that, which we'll hear a little bit more about later. But before that then, from the other project partners, we will hear from how they experienced it working with their particular groups, either the migrant women, the LBTI women, or the women with disabilities. And of course then the women who are working or who are living in one of the shelters or who are using the services of APUCH. I think one of the things that has been very clear within the whole of the project is how people need to continue to do the work, as it was said by our speakers this morning, of both prevention but also then support work for people who are actually experiencing the violence right now. You can't just prevent or you can't just support. You actually have to do both so that you decrease the numbers who actually need the support eventually. So it's been a very complex project, but I think ultimately very successful in terms of its outputs. But now maybe if we could just move on then to Dr. Andreana Dibben and to hear the results of the research looking at what was the impact of the training or of the different awareness raising campaigns that were happening. So, Andreana?
Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you, Honor Rosianne and Andreana. We share the same name as well. First of all, I have quite a chunk of time, I realized, and I realized that not everybody gets as excited with research as I do. So I am going to try to make this as entertaining at least as possible, even though some of the stuff may be technical and a bit more methodological, but I will leave space for questions, and even throughout the presentation, if there is anything else, if there is anything you want to ask, you may do so as well. I would also, before we start, thank you so much for your speeches, and thank you, Katja, as well, because you have highlighted the importance of action. And following my presentation after the break, I am going to have to leave because apart from being a lecturer at university, I'm also the chairperson of the Women's Rights Foundation. And right now there is a woman whose passport has been taken, and so by the courts of Malta, and I have to go and fight for her right to freedom of movement. And in fact, I hope that the Commissioner and Rosianne will support us on this as well. So that's my piece of action this morning. I couldn't come here and not mention it because it's been on our minds 24 hours a day right now. Okay, so the project team is composed of myself, Dr. Briguglio, and Dr. Janice Patch-Formosa. Unfortunately, due to the situation right now, both Dr. Briguglio and Dr. Janice Patch-Formosa could not be here with us live. Because they both have certain personal circumstances that did not allow them to. We were also supported by a research officer, Ms. Charlene Seikel, who was working with us part-time. Since, of course, the project ended, she is now back to her, she's working full-time somewhere else, so again, she could not join us today. There are certain aspects in the study, like, for example, the statistical analysis, that was more the remit of Dr. Briguglio and Dr. Pac-Formosa. I will try to explain them as well as I can, but if you have the report and you can actually see the information there, but if there are certain questions or you want to elaborate further on things that I cannot answer you, you are free to email us, and we will, of course, answer your queries by email. Okay, so let's start. So during this presentation, which I realize is around 1 hour long, we're going to go through all this. So first we start with the purpose of the research. We look at the literature review that we looked at, the methodology, the findings from both the quantitative research and the qualitative focus groups, and then, of course, the impact of the training and the recommendations for future. Okay, so if I hash down l'animations, dejjem ingerfix fihom. Okay, so I think it is very, very important to understand the framework in which this project and the research took place. We are, most of us, familiar with, of course, the Council of Europe's Istanbul Convention, and the Istanbul Convention addresses all forms of violence against women, including domestic violence, through the following measures: preventing violence, protecting victims, and prosecuting the perpetrators. And in fact, of course, this project was very much aimed at prevention. But even when it comes to prevention, there are different types of prevention. And this project addressed both primary prevention, which aims to reduce the incidence of the problem before it occurs. So all the initiatives and the deliverables that were carried out with the children and young persons were forms of primary prevention. And then we have secondary prevention, which aims to decrease the prevalence after early signs of the problems. And I would say that the interventions with the adults, with the LBT participants, with the disabled women, and with the migrant women would form part of this, because we know through research and through statistics that these groups are particularly, together with other groups, more vulnerable to violence because of intersectional issues, issues and discrimination in relation to race, in relation to disability, in relation to sexuality. So and gender issues as well. So of course, over there, it's considered as secondary preventions, because there are already signs that, of course, there would be issues because of their context. So the purpose of the research, in particular, was that it was an impact evaluation. So it was aimed to see whether the knowledge, the attitudes and behaviors towards violence against women, and also the attitudes in relation to gender equality of women with disability, migrant women and LBT women, children and youths, who all participated in the project, pre-training and post-training, whether there has been a change, whether there has been any impact. Did the project work? Did the training work? Did the training make a difference? So that was the whole idea of this. And I think it is very, very important because there's a lot of money, not enough, there should be much more money spent on prevention programs, on these kind of behavior changing trainings, etc., campaigns, public campaigns. But unless we measure if they are actually working and what we need to target, we don't know if we're really making a difference. So I think it is very, very important for us to measure, to know what has worked, and then to ultimately target and change our intervention, so we make sure that we are actually targeting. I have to say that changing behavior is very, very difficult. So while, for example, what Katja was showing, those small changes, you might say, lol, they're not so big, those changes, but changing behavior is one of the most difficult things one can achieve. Knowledge is much easier because if you don't know something and then you learn it, you have acquired that knowledge. So it's much easier to test. But also to test whether there has actually been a change in behavior is very, very difficult. And sometimes we realize that the change sometimes, unfortunately, may happen in a different direction. So it could be sometimes counterproductive, although there is a reasoning behind that. In fact, I was surprised that, not surprised, I wasn't surprised, but I was like, Ara, it's the same thing. Because both in the telephone survey and in the project, the incidence of people who would talk to the perpetrator and stop him decreased. But there is a reason for that, because people, when they start thinking more about the situation and they start realizing how complex it can be and what the consequences may be, they might actually be less likely to intervene. But they might be more likely to behave what we call more suitably. So, for example, call the police rather than getting in and butting in and potentially jeopardize their own safety, for example. So it does not mean that that change shows an indifference. It could be that people have thought about it and actually now realize that they have to behave in a suitable manner. And this was reflected even in our training with the children, with the young people, and with the adults. So what were the indicators of change that we measured? In terms of knowledge, we measured knowledge about types of violence, okay? So knowledge about all the different types of violence, and then knowledge about services. So we assessed if there was a difference in the knowledge. We also assessed whether there was a difference in the attitudes. So attitudes in relation to violence against women, attitudes in relation to gender stereotyping of self and others, and attitudes in relation to gender-based teasing or harassment of peers. In terms of exposure, we looked at whether participants would disclose exposure of violence and both violence that they have witnessed and violence on themselves, whether they have themselves experienced it. And then we looked at intent, which, as I said, is one of the most difficult things to change. So the intent to seek help, the intent to intervene, and the intent to report. Okay, so these were the things that we looked at, whether there has been a change in any of these things. So I'm going to mention the definition that we used. Basically, we used the Istanbul Convention's definition of violence against women. And basically, we define violence as a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against women. And it means all acts of gender-based violence that result in or are likely to result in physical, sexual, psychological, or economic harm or suffering to women, including the threats of such acts, coercion, arbitrary deprivation of liberty, whether occurring in public or in private life. So this is the definition of violence against women, and of gender-based violence, and of violence against women, violence that is directed against women because she is a woman, or that affects women disproportionately, okay? So this is the definition that we used. We've already had these mentions, these statistics, but maybe it's a good thing to remind ourselves. Every time I look at them, I again remind myself of why I get involved, why I do this work, because the incidence of violence is shocking, because we know that 1 in 3 women, so 1 in 3 women, so in this room there's many women, there's 1 in 3 of us who have experienced violence for sure, has been a victim of physical or sexual violence. So 1 in 3 women. 1 in 20 women have been raped, okay? Over half of women have experienced sexual harassment, okay? Whether it's on the street, whether it's at work, etc. And 1 in 3 women have experienced psychological abusive behavior by a partner, okay? In Malta, and this is from the survey on crime, that on the dark figure of crime, we also know that 85% of all sex offenses go unreported, okay? And in the report, there's even more information of the women who actually answer. Sorry, Patricia, I'm realizing I'm giving you my back. No, just because I saw you from the mirror. I'm seeing you from the mirror. Of the reasons of why they get unreported and what are the barriers. And in fact, the Commission themselves, before this project, had another project and actually have a publication on the barriers that women experience. And there's a lot of barriers that women have mentioned. Sorry? 9 main barriers, yes. Okay. Yes, and of course, before we designed our questionnaire and before as we were thinking about the research, we had to think about what do we know already? What do we know about Malta? What should we target? Where are the problems? And one of our biggest source of information and most recent was the Eurobarometer on gender-based violence, which took place, if I'm not mistaken, 2017. But I can't remember, and I don't have it written. But it's very recent. So these are small, but I am going to go through them one by one because they are so important. So we know that 96% of people in Malta agree that violence against women happens mostly in the home. So we know that in Malta, that's not an issue anymore. It's not an issue that people don't realize that there is violence. Most people, 96% of them, know that domestic violence is an issue and that women are very likely to experience violence at home. So it's not like, I didn't know these things happen in Malta. No, everybody knows these things happen in Malta now. 85% also say that sexual harassment against women is common. So again, there is awareness. People know that sexual harassment is common. Potentially, this is even more of a problem because I would say not only is it common, but it's normalized. Lily, you know, it's one of our biggest memes, that you're passing through the street and you get all kind of harassment. 96% are aware of the multiple support services for women who are victims of domestic violence. So yes, kudos to all the organizations working. They have been doing their work. Maltese people know about you, okay? So Maltese people know that there is a POCH, that there is the Commission, that there are all the NGOs, 179, the police, etc. So 96% know that these services exist. And so far here we're doing really well, you know, in terms of, okay, so there is awareness, we are aware of the issues, we are aware that there is support, but then the problems start when it comes to attitudes. So even though all these people, the majority, 96%, and everyone knows about all of these things, more than half, 57%, are not likely to speak about it if they know someone who has been a victim. So yes, we know, but it's not my business, you know? So 57% still will not talk about it if they know there is a victim. They will not speak up, okay? 47%, and this I have to say, unfortunately, is the highest in all of Europe, okay? This is the highest, we are the worst faring country in relation to this. So nearly half, we're talking 47%, believe that women often make up or exaggerate claims of violence or rape, okay? So we still have half of people in Malta who believe that women are liars, that women exaggerate, that women are trying to trap men. And I mean, this is not a surprise. If you go on social media, if you go and look at the discourse out there, you know that this is not a surprise because we see this time and again. Whatever. Ma xamlitlu. Ma ktem jisagġiraw. And that's because they're separating and she wants to take the kids and she's trying to get back to him. We never believed them. Or what was she wearing? What was she doing? Did she go with him? Did she provoke him? So these are things that we know. 40%, so again, very close, think that violence against women is often provoked by the victim. Again, imma xamlitlu. Okay, so we know, or how did she behave? Was she drunk? Did she go with him to a secluded beach? Was she walking alone in the street at night? Yes, the attitude is that violence is often provoked. And again, this is the highest in Europe, so we have problems there as well. Unfortunately, 20%, and you say, we at 20% is not so high, but it's 1/5 of Malta. And again, it's the highest in Europe. 20% agree that sexual intercourse without consent is justified if the person is wearing provocative clothing. Okay, so I think 1/5 of people still think that if you go out wearing a miniskirt or a sexy dress or whatever you're wearing and someone jumps you or assumes that you're up for it, you know, this is, they agree that this is the case, and that's very worrying. And then, of course, more than half, erroneously, I would say, because most rapes do not happen in this way. So all this violence is happening, but it's not me that is doing it for sure. So 50% agree that women are more likely to be raped by a stranger than someone they know. So we still think that the classic walking in the street in the dark and someone jumps you in an alley is the way that rapes happen. And in reality, we know that this is not the case, that most rapes happen within relationships, within families, within workplaces where actually the perpetrator knows the victim. Okay, and that is also another barrier why many women do not speak up as well, because there are so many other dynamics involved. If it's your, I don't know, grandfather, or your uncle, or your husband, or your boyfriend. So these were this was the information from the Eurobarometer that for us was very important. That we said we have to use this both to inform the training, and in fact, before we did the research, there was also a lot of meetings with the people who were designing the training. They knew about these statistics to address these issues. These are the issues that need to be addressed in the training. And also, for us to measure them as well. We wanted to know whether the training was actually changing these attitudes and what the attitudes were as well before. We also looked at other evaluations of prevention programs. So we looked in the literature and we saw how it was done in other countries. And basically, when you talk about evaluated programs, it means that they are those that include a post-test, so that you actually give people a questionnaire to test what they know, or better, a pre and post test, because with a pre and post, you know, you can actually measure the change. And also, we found that there were, and actually they were considered the best, if there would be a qualitative assessment as well of knowledge and skill development and attitudinal or behavioral changes, because the qualitative element builds and captures things that sometimes the surveys do not. So these were some of the, this was what we define as an evaluated programs. Well, most literature that we found focused, so we realized that it's not something that is normally done. So we realized that of all the many programs take place and are not, unfortunately, evaluated in terms of impact. You know, so there's a lot of lack of research, but it has started, and most of it Most of the literature on evaluation focuses on specific programs to prevent rape and sexual assault, particularly students in the United States. In the United States, you might have heard about it. There is a huge problems when it comes to rape and sexual assault in colleges and universities on campus. You know, they all live there. It's a different context completely. And because of this, there has been a huge impetus to carry out, in fact, actually it's obligatory now by law, that universities carry out these programs for students on how to prevent rape and sexual violence on campus. And because, of course, there is this impetus to have all these programs, now there is a lot of studies that evaluate the impact of, sorry, għandek raġun, xina mdorrija ndur l-emmula, għandek raġun. So I'll stay here, put. So most of the literature focused on these programs. And they take, this is I found this very, very interesting. In fact, it's one of the recommendations that we make. They take what is called a bystander approach. So rather than in the training, you kind of address people, you are a potential victim or you are a potential perpetrator, especially when it is gender-based, usually people get on the defensive. If I'm a man or a boy, they're looking at me as if I am a potential perpetrator. And the women, I am a potential victim. So in order to get out of this, get out of this dichotomy that men are potential perpetrators, women, they took this bystander approach, actually says everybody is involved in the fight of violence. All of you can be bystanders. All of you can be witness to violence, whether you're a man or whether you're a woman, and especially you have a responsibility, and let's all together try to stop it. So this is what a bystander approach. So we take this approach that we are not potential victims or potential perpetrators, but we are all potential bystanders. And they take this approach in order to address and try to change behavior in relation to taking action, to intervene, to report, and to actually call out if there are things going on. So results actually show that most programs have mixed outcomes and very modest results, especially long term. So even in the literature, even in all of these programs, especially sometimes they measure actual behavior. So they leave a year and they say, in this past year, when you witnessed, how did you behave? And again, they realize that there is in Maltese, we have a saying, bej il-kliem u l-fatti hemm baħar jikkumbatti. So there is a huge difference between what people intend and what people believe, but when they come to the actual situation, how they behave. And so it is very, very difficult to change behavior. And in fact, that is why most programs have mixed outcomes. And when it comes to long term, especially long term, very, very modest results. Changing minds and hearts is one of the most difficult things to do. Changing laws and policies, even though it's hard, it's much easier. But then when it comes to changing behaviors, there are so many things that work against you that it's much more difficult. So we knew that this is the context that we are working on. So we did not expect miracles either, and let's not try to expect miracles. And as I said, it is much more challenges to change attitudes and behavior than it is to change knowledge. So knowledge is much easier, either you know it or you don't. But behavior then is much more challenging. Have I bored you yet? Mela, let's go to the methodology. So the methodology is basically the way that we carried out the project, the way that we worked, the research. So, as already was mentioned, quantitative data was collected through a self-administered pre-test and post-test questionnaire with all the participants. And in the report, in the appendix, you can actually find a copy of the survey that we used. The post-test questionnaire was repeated at 3 months post-intervention. So we actually had pre-questionnaire, pre-training. So before they started the training, they filled it out. They filled out the same survey after the training, immediately after, and then 3 months following all the interventions that had taken place, we again asked them to fill out the questionnaire again to see if there were any long-term changes. Some questionnaires were also administered with a control group. So a control group is people from the same population who did not participate in the project. And this was obviously done with the help of all the organizations. I am seeing Umayma here and Joyce. So we had the Migrant Women Association, we had the Girl Guides and the Scouts, where we basically identified other people in their organization who did not participate. We sent them the questionnaire and they filled it as well. So we could see whether those had different results. And then qualitative data was collected through focus groups with participants as well as with the trainers, because for the trainers, they will tell you more in the panel probably, this was a learning experience as well. Most of the organizations, apart from the Girl Guides who have been working on this, kudos to you, for quite some time, even, for example, they're focused on disability, or they're focused on migrant women, or they're focused on LBT. But they're not so focused on violence. Violence is just one of the issues. So they're not experts in relation to violence. So this project for them was a learning experience as well. But they had the strength of the knowledge of their particular client group or working group. And in this way, so the knowledge was combined together. There was an expert on violence who was also helping them out in designing the training, and they had the expertise of the particular groups. And in fact, one of the most interesting focus groups that was carried out was the ones with the trainers themselves and what they have achieved. So to explore basically and describe the process through which change was achieved. Survey design, we did not invent the survey ourselves. We did not, in research, there's no point in reinventing the wheel. So basically, all of the questions, all of the constructs within the survey were designed with reference to existing surveys, okay? Existing surveys in the literature, and of course they were indented and they were modified to capture the indicators of change that were assigned. And these were the main sources, okay? So these are of course tried and tested for reliability and validity. So it makes sense, and some of these were used in many, many different contexts, from Asia to Africa to America. So they would be, so you would know that the questions that you are asking have been tested. And this is what, these are some of them, you know, like the Eurobarometer, attitudes about relationship violence, GEM scale, adolescent masculinity ideology in relationships, Illinois rape myth acceptance, bystander attitude scale. So these are some scales that already exist. And the Girl Guides one, the WAGS evaluation, that is used worldwide when it comes to the training developed by the Girl Guides. And these were all used and included in the survey. And this is how the survey was designed. What was very good as well, because then you could compare to the literature, and you could actually compare the actual construct. So how did we fare compared to where this survey was carried out? And the final survey content include, first of all, information about consent, demographics about the respondent, knowledge about types of violence, impact of violence and services, attitudes towards gender-based violence, attitudes towards seeking help or reporting, attitudes towards gender stereotyping of both themselves and others, and attitudes towards gender-based harassment. Exposure to situations of domestic violence, and intent to respond to other women experiencing violence. Intent to disclose violence, to confront sexist behavior, and to engage in gender non-conforming behavior. So these were basically the questions. The final sample, can't see them from here. And I don't know them by heart. You have to look at them in the report. Let me see. So, of course, the biggest group were the young people, where we had, from the Girl Guides and the Scouts, where we had 160 respondents before and 177 respondents post-training. With the adults, we had a much larger control group because the actual intervention group was very small. So the intervention group had 31, but then the control group had about 99. And with the children, it was very equal. We had around 67 pre-training, 63 post-training, and 65 control. So in all, we had around 800, I think, or 700 or something, it's in the report, questionnaires. So we had quite some data to work with in total. Of course, we were limited in terms of, for example, with the adults, that is where we were most limited because the numbers were so small of people who participated that when it comes to quantitative research, you can't make assumptions from such a small sample. But that is why the focus groups were so important as well. The data collection process, basically, of course, in the beginning, we translated the survey, first of all, before we even started, we had consultation sessions with all the entities and with the domestic violence and with the violence expert, Alexander. So we met with migrant women, we met with MGRM, with CRPD, and with the Girl Guides to see what they were going to include in the training, what the training consists of. In terms of the Girl Guides, they used a training that they had used before, so they actually gave us all the material so we could actually see what they were going to include. The other ones, they designed them for the sake of the project. So we were actually with them when they were designing them. Like, we had met with them and knew what they were going to include. In fact, there were variations as well. So, for example, with CRPD, there was the self-defense session because they wanted an actual physical self-defense session. And that was different from the other trainings because they were adapted to the group and what they wanted. Then we translated the survey into Maltese. There were some translations available for the Eurobarometer, but not for the other surveys. This was very interesting process because, of course, we had to make sure that everybody could understand this survey. So we had a consultation with a person with intellectual disability, and we went through all the questions, and we changed some of the language, we changed some of the words to make sure that they were easier to understand. And then we decided to use that for everyone, so not just for disabled persons. We said, you know, simple, there's nothing, the simpler the better for everyone. So when we adapted it in that way, we used it with everyone. We piloted it with a few people, and then we also created an easy-to-read version for those people with intellectual difficulties and even with literacy difficulties, etc. And children, of course, they need picture. The whole easy-to-read version is not in the report because it was it took a lot of pages because it has pictures and bigger fonts and all this. But if anyone wants access to it, feel free to email us and we will provide access to it. We modified the content for young people and for children. In fact, the children had a very, very abridged version of the survey. And there were also modifications in the medium of the survey. Now, this was not something that we really wanted because it creates even more variation. We designed this to be a paper and pen survey. However, first of all, the first time it was due to accessibility. So when it comes to certain disabled women, it was not possible for them to complete the pen and paper. So they had to do they did the online survey. And then it was a question of reaching out to people. So with the online survey, it was much easier, for example, to reach the control group. Post-training, once everyone went home and was not there in the room, we tried to do it pen and paper. We sent all the questionnaire. We only received one, I think. We received one. So then we decided to go online through the organization, and the organizations posted it on their Facebook and on their intranet and all this, and then we started receiving responses. So we had a mix of media. Some of them did the pen and paper, some of them did the online. And sometimes that creates issues as well with analysis in terms of if you're online, you could maybe look up the information, you know, so it's a limitation, let's put it that way. Although I think you have to be quite intense and dedicated to actually look up every sentence of the survey online to make sure you answer correctly. The focus groups, basically, as I said, were carried out to gain further insight on the information sessions and training through qualitative data. We collected information on expectations with the participants, this is why there's a P, reflecting on the experience, both the content and the process, what they perceive to be the impact of the sessions, how they have changed them. And then with the trainers, we also looked at examples of good practice, so what they recognized as examples of good practice, the lessons learned and the unexpected benefits, and the plans related to how they are going now to embed this and mainstream it in their day-to-day services. So these are, in the focus groups, we looked at all of this. We had 5 focus groups related to this research. We had one with the adults. We actually got them together. CRPD, MGRM, and Migrant Women Association participants all together. A sample of them, of course, 6 of them, with young ambassadors, with the youth ambassadors. We had a focus group with the leaders of older children, Scout and Girl Guides leaders. We had one with the leaders of younger children, and we had one with the trainers of the adult programs. Okay, so those were the focus groups that were conducted. Now, data analysis. I'm not going to go into this, I'm just going to say, for each subgroup, you know, there were histograms, were inspected, blah, blah, blah. Correlation analysis took place. Mean, variance, count, t-tests, witness tests. These are the statistical analysis tests that were used to actually, it's all in the report, and those of you who are that way inclined and want to read how the statistical analysis took place can actually do it. I know most of us are not really very interested to know exactly how the statistical analysis took place. But it's the crux of it, basically, so it's the most important part. Because it all depends on the kind of analysis that you carry out. So the analysis is very important. It's just a bit more technical. So basically, we use a method called comparisons of means. You take the mean, pre-test and post-test, and you compare whether there has been a change between the means. And then whether they are statistically significant, okay? Whether those changes can actually be statistically significant in the impact analysis. Of course, the null hypothesis in quantitative research, you have a null hypothesis. And the null hypothesis is that no change takes place. So the null hypothesis was that the difference in the responses given pre-training and post-training was not significantly different from 0. The alternative hypothesis, which would show the impact, where the training caused a change in the mean, in knowledge, in attitudes and beliefs, and a greater propensity to behave suitably if exposed to gender-based violence. Okay, so that's the data analysis. And for the focus group analysis, a general inductive approach for qualitative evaluation data was used. Of course, the project had the research had limitations. I would say this was a strength in the project and a limitation for the study, because there was considerable diversity in the content, in the dosage, and in the duration of the training, as well as the experience of the trainers. So we had trainers who had been doing this for years, and we had trainers who had just been trained themselves and had done it for the first time with a mentor, but still. We had some groups who, for example, did the training on 2 Saturdays, whole days. And we had some groups who met for 2 hours, 8 every week. So, of course, this is a strength in the project because it was flexible to the needs of the community. It was flexible to the needs of the particular groups that decided to take part. But when it comes to measuring, then it creates a whole lot of trouble because let's say the ideal conditions would be in a lab. In the real world, there's a lot of other variables. The more diversity you include and the more variation, the much more difficult to measure it is. So it was a strength in the project, I would say, but a limitation for the research, all this diversity of how it was done. Again, in the survey medium, as we already mentioned, there was diversity in that. There was attrition post-training. Of course, this is very, very normal that some people will not answer the survey. And in fact, I mean, there was research fatigue as well. But how many times I'm going to fill this survey? I already filled it twice, and then you're asking me to do this a third time. You know, it's the same survey. It's not like you're giving me a different one. So, of course, you have attrition. And also, a difficulty in attaining control groups. I mean, the participants were invested because they attended the training, but the control groups were people who did not attend the training, so they were not as invested in this as they were. So we had difficulty in that respect as well. Difficulties in completing survey, even though we did the piloting and even though we did the consultation, we found out that throughout the data collection process, that still there were difficulties in completing the survey with young people, with children, with migrant women, difficulties related to language, difficulties related to maturity in terms of not understanding certain questions or not being relatable to their context, and also difficulties in cultural acceptability. So, for example, with migrant women, there were some questions that they didn't even want to answer because it involved the word alcohol, or dating, which was not, it was considered as not suitable for them. So, in those cases, we realized that those questions were left out. So they were not filled in. So there were these situations. And again, resistance to survey questions. So difficulties in competence, and resistance was mostly, I don't like this question, I'm not going to fill it in. And in the focus group, the participation was quite low as well. The numbers were quite small. Of course, it's very, very difficult. I mean, most of these organizations, these NGOs are very small. Most of the people were volunteers themselves. The trainers were volunteers. I mean, the dedication that they have is something to really, really admire. And then asking them to come to do the focus group. This was pre-COVID. I mean, a good idea would have been to do them on Zoom, but back then we didn't know about Zoom. Now, you think, let's do it on Zoom. It's much easier, to get people to come to university, that traffic, parking, it's a nightmare. So, of course, we understand this. It's a normal feature of research nowadays as well. Okay, so if we had to look at the variables that were used, the knowledge, I'm not going to go into them, but these are the knowledge variables. We had a list of questions and participants had to say, true or false or don't know. Okay, so for example, I'm just going to read one. It is illegal if an employer tells a woman she will be paid less than a man because she is pregnant. So that is a knowledge question. True, false, don't know. And we measured success through leads a decrease in I don't know. So we saw if there was a decrease in the I don't know questions, basically. The attitudes questions, I'm not even going to try to read them. Just one I'm going to read. An interesting one, my eyes went on it. Men need sex more than women do. So that was an attitude question, one of the attitude questions, and beliefs. So another one, let me see another one. Let me see. A woman should tolerate violence to keep the family together, for example, a classic one. So these were some attitudes and beliefs, and they actually said, I strongly agree, disagree, blah, blah, blah. The exposure was, do you know of anyone who has been a victim of domestic violence, sexual assault, or sexual harassment? Do you know men? Do you know women? How do you know this person? So friends, neighbors, work. If yes, then did you speak to anyone about it? Who did you speak to? And why? If not, why didn't you speak about it? So it was none of my business. I did not know what to do, blah, blah, blah. So there was a list. So these were the exposure variables. And the intent is how likely are you to do something? So how likely are you to say something to a friend if I hear that she or he forced sex on someone? How likely are you to tell friends that they deserve to be treated well by their partner? How likely are you? So these are questions of intent, okay? And then we had a behavior scenario. The behavior scenario was an imaginary situation where you are at a wedding party and you see a couple you know arguing. You see that the man is grabbing her by the shoulders, shaking her, and then pushing her. The woman is not a friend of yours, and neither is the man, but you do hang around with the same group of people. Other people who are seeing this are not doing anything. What would you do? So we had this, and then we had different varieties for the different groups. So for the children, it was at a birthday party, and the boy pushes a girl. With the young people, it was at a done. And then we did a variation. We did a Romanian scenario. So we said, let's pick out, I don't know, it was Romanian, because in the pilot group we had a Romanian, but then we didn't have any Eastern European women in the actual training. But anyway, but in half of the survey, we changed a variable to see whether there would be a different behavior. And then the change was the woman would be Romanian and the men would be Maltese, to see if there would be a change of whether the people would actually intervene. So we gave half the participants the Maltese version, and we gave half of them the Romanian version. And they could either do nothing, shout out something that like, hey, what are you doing, you know? Talk to the girl or the woman at some point and let her know that you saw what was going on and you are willing to help her. Talk to the man and tell him that it was not okay and that he needs to get help, or other things. And we left people to decide what they would do, okay? For the children, it was different. It was talk to an adult, or, you know, so there were different variations to this. In terms of demographic data, for the adults, the mean age was 42. They were mostly single. They had a post-education, this is the mean, okay? This is the average, so of course there are variations. Post-education level of education, there was a range in employment status. Half of them were parents with a mean of 1 to 2 children, living in households with 3 adults. All respondents lived in Malta. There was some diversity in the language preference, like what kind of language do you speak, what language do you speak, and a higher than average happiness. The happiness is a standard thing that you ask from 1 to 10, how do you feel right now? Of course, you would, moods and affect answers. So even now in COVID, we have seen a difference, not in this research, in other research, we have seen a difference in happiness. Young ambassadors and older children, the mean age was 14. Okay, it was from 12 to about 19, 20, I think, the range. slightly higher for control group, so the control group were a bit older. They were like 15 or 16. Mainly female, even though the project took place with both genders, there were still many more girls who participated. Most of them were living in households with 3 adults and a mean of 1 to 2 children. Most of them lived in Malta, but there was a diversity in language as well, and a relative high average of happiness. The control group had equal distribution between boys and girls. So for the participants were mostly girls. But then when we gave the questionnaire out to the scout groups who did not participate, there was a mix. So there were more boys there. And then with the younger children, the mean age was 9. I have to say that the project was open to children from 5. But of course, when it comes to the survey, most of them were pre-literate. So we decided to only give the survey to those who were 7 onwards. The mean age was 9, with a slightly lower age for the control group. Respondents were more likely to be girls as well, female, living in households with 2 adults and a mean of 1 to 2 children. Residents lived in Malta, and in this case, the majority were Maltese-speaking. And the relative high average of happiness, again, the control group had more boys and girls than the training. And now, if we had to look at what happened, was there an impact? The dunque. Changes in knowledge. So, changes in knowledge were measured as fewer instances of don't know answers post-training. And there was a general reduction in the frequency of don't know answers in several of the questions intended to gauge knowledge. So we know that in terms of knowledge, the project, the training really worked. So there was much less likelihood that people will answer, I don't know. In terms of statistical significance, when you do the analysis for the adults, this was statistically significant for 3 questions. And I have to say, again, the adults was the lower number, so it's much more difficult to gain statistical significance when you have a smaller sample. With the youth ambassadors and older children, there were statistically significant changes in 4 questions, but also a significant increase of the responses acknowledging that violence takes place at home. The young people, different from the adults pre-training, were more likely to say that violence happens online. And then post-training, it changed. They said it's more likely to happen at home. As well as an increase in responses that violence takes place at work. So at home and at work increased their answers. With younger children, while there was an observed change in the knowledge, but none of these changes were large enough to yield a statistically significant signal. So although there were changes, and we know there were changes, they were not statistically significant. Okay, knowledge of services. The expectation, of course, was for the less obvious services to receive stronger mention post-training, and this was achieved. This aim was achieved. In fact, we see for the adults, there were changes in the mention of services, with some services receiving more mentions, while others receiving lower mentions. So before, most of them mentioned appoġġ. After the training, a lot mentioned the Women's Rights Foundation and the Editus Foundation. And of course, this was mainly because members of Women's Rights Foundation and Editus Foundation actually came to the training and participated in the trainings, like they gave sessions. So that knowledge was absorbed. With the young children, before it was mostly appoġġ and girl guides, as well as 179, 112, and 117. I don't know what that is, that number. I'm not sure if done. And the cybercrime unit increased significantly post-training, and there was also a statistically significant increase in the mention of online help, specifically kellimni.com and SOAR. And again, I think SOAR participated in the training. Did anyone come? apparently after the training, they became aware of the organization SOAR. So there was more, or maybe they looked it up. With younger children, post-training guidance counselors was significantly less, reflecting a larger variety of service providers mentioned instead. So they actually had a larger variety. Changes in attitudes and beliefs. Again, post-training, the expectation was for an overall change in attitudes and beliefs towards higher equality and lower tolerance of gender-based violence. In the adults, none of the questions returned changes that were significantly different. However, in terms of belief, there was a decline in support for the statement, I think it's important for a man to pretend he's having sex even if he is not. So for some reason, this was one of the most significant questions. I don't know what kind of discussions happened in the training, but this resulted in a strong statistically significant change, a decline in support of this. But it's related to macho behavior, you know, this idea that in terms of pretending that you're doing something you're not, because there was a lot of discussion even in the focus group, and I can see it. There were so many discussions related to, because men are really disadvantaged, because they are in circles where they are with other men, and they have to show that they are strong, that they are, you know, the macho, etc. And there is a lot of pressure in that regard. And I think that those discussions were reflected. The strongest effect here were observed with older children, and this was very significant because it was even reflected in the behavior for the statement, making sexual comments or jokes to a woman in the street. So over there seems to have been an awareness like this is not on, and they actually changed their attitudes towards it. There was a strong decline as well in support for the statement, a woman should tolerate violence to keep her family together. So a strong decline in that. And also, a father should have more power than the mother in family decisions. So when it comes to gender stereotypes, there was a decline in the support to those statements, which is quite a good impact. And these were all statistically significant, so the change can actually be measured in that way. There was also, although they were not statistically significant, but we could actually see the trends, an increase in support for the statement. These were young people, remember. It is all right for a woman to ask a man out on a date. So a change in that behavior. And it is better if a female police officer deals with a woman who reports rape. So after the training, they felt that it would be better if a female police officer is the one who deals with a rape victim who goes to report. Younger children, they did not have as many, of course, they did not have anything about sex or anything like that, or dating, but they had some different ones, and actually not different, but a subset. And there was an observed decline in the belief that it is silly for boys to play with dolls. So post-training, not so many children believed then that it was silly for boys to play with dolls, and that was a significant change as well. In intent, this, as I said, is the most difficult as well, because the pre and post survey happened. How am I with time? Mela Fadal. All right. Given that they were very, very close to each other, the pre and post survey training, it was hardly expected that any changes would occur. So we didn't expect that there would be huge changes because they were too close. However, the young people, were the ones who experienced longer time lapse pre and post training, so they recorded slightly higher exposure rates, as well as statistically significant difference in the propensity to speak to a doctor or nurse about what they witnessed. So there was this one of the tick boxes, who would you speak to? It included speak to a doctor. And I would say, again, it comes from, this emphasis on speak to someone you trust. And in Malta, we very much know that doctors tend to have quite a high level of trust, especially if you have a GP who has been with you growing up all your life. And there was a higher propensity that they would actually speak to a doctor if they experienced anything. There were changes in intent, but not all of these were in the expected directions, as we said. So, for example, sometimes there was a lower propensity to act in terms of maybe realizing that it's so complex, and what am I going to get myself into? And then deciding not to act, but none of these were significantly in terms of statistics. And then when forced with the hypothetical scenario, there was no statistically significant changes among the adults after training. Among the young people, there was a lower, similar to the survey, a lower propensity to talk to the perpetrator and instead to talk to the victim rather than the perpetrator. So before the training, they would say, I would go and tell him something. After the training, they were like, no, I will speak to her after and show her that I'm here to help. And this shows again that it doesn't mean that it's less action, but it's just a different form of action that perhaps is more suitable in terms of safety as well. So it was important. So, lajta ta ġifieri ma. Among the young people, as I said, among children, there was a similar decline in the likelihood that children would shout something out loud. So, ma naqbaċ najjat ħallija jew hekk. So there was a larger propensity mur inkellem it-teacher jew il-parent jew l-adult. Mela le? Yes. Iktarar. Eżatt.
Because, once you leave the woman on her own with the man,
yes,
she is in a more vulnerable situation. Because she showed up, this man, to a stranger.
Yes.
What it would be?
I mean, in fact, I don't think there's an easy answer to this. And again, of course, when you're in the heat of the moment, you don't know how you're going to react. But I think that this was, and I wasn't there during the training, but I would imagine, and perhaps in the panel, the people who actually did the training can discuss, that this was one of the discussions that was discussed, and what would you do? And I would say that from the research, we found a propensity that they would not intervene because potentially there are many consequences, and that they would either speak to the victim after, if they know her, of course. I mean, if it's in the street, it's a completely different scenario, or else to call the authorities. So call the police, 112, etc. Joyce wanted to say something. Obliged to call the police. Yes. Use the mic because of the camera.
By law now you are obliged to report any violence you see. So that's the first action. You can help the victim by telling her, come with me, or move her aside. But you never approach the perpetrator to safeguard yourself.
Yes. So I would say that in the training, this was something that was covered?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
I mean, especially for leaders that have a disclosure. You don't go to the parent and say, listen, your kid just came over and said that the father's abusing, or that you've been abusing your own child. You do not approach the perpetrator. You do the disclosure reporting, you go through the necessary steps, and the board, because of the child protection policy of each NGO, there was a specific board with professionals on it. So you report to the board, they assess, and then they take action. But obviously, you keep your eye on the child to see. But if it is imminent danger, I mean, if they have just been sexually assaulted, you're not going to send them back home. So you
Or if it's
report
in
and you
this-
take him to a
yes.
doctor.
Yes. So it seems that this was a message that was well received because statistically significant change in reduction of people who would actually approach the perpetrator and then instead either approach the victim or report in this case. Again, or the children shouting out loud, which is actually as well drawing attention to the situation. So we therefore find a lower propensity to act, but this can be interpreted as a higher propensity to behave suitably. So actually, there was a change in that as well. And I would say, because it's a change in intent, it's also a change in knowledge, because some people wouldn't know. So they wouldn't know how best to react. And in the training, it was addressed, and they seemed more confident about their response. Okay, so overall, it is plausible to reject the null hypothesis. So the changes which occurred after training were not zero. So there were statistically significant changes. The greatest level of support was that there was an overall increase in knowledge around issues of gender-based violence. Some support for the proposition that there was a slight change in attitudes and beliefs towards higher equality and lower tolerance of gender-based violence, and weak support that post-training there is a greater awareness of the presence of gender-based violence and the higher propensity, and there is a higher propensity to act suitably. But again, these were what we expected. So highest support in knowledge, some support in change in attitudes, and a weaker support, although it was there, to change behavior. The strongest results were among the young people, okay? Followed by the adults. The weakest results were observed among the children, okay? And I think this is something interesting to observe further. It could have been related to the training. It could have been related to the fact that children process information differently. It could be related to the fact that maybe the children did not understand the survey very well and had more difficulty in filling it out and were bored with filling it out because they wanted to get on with other things. So you can't interpret this as a Bible, but you know, it's something to be potentially done. Again, to keep in mind always that differences between results could also have been due to different composition of the sample that completed the questionnaire. Questionnaire content does not necessarily reflect the extent of knowledge. I am sure that there was so much more knowledge and changes that participants truly experienced, that the survey did not capture them. For example, the self-defense was not captured anywhere in the survey. You know, so like, how do you know your karate chops now? I mean, it was, but there was a lot of discussions and knowledge that come up in these kind of trainings that, of course, you can't cover everything. Part of the reasons for observing change or lack of it also could have been due to sample size, as I said, different samples, and the time lag and duration between pre and post. There wasn't too long. I mean, one of them, for example, they did the pre on Friday evening and the post on Sunday. So you can't measure changes in such a short period of time. And our analysis focused on difference in means, so there may also be differences if one does different statistical analysis, and we are open to use that data if anyone wants to access the data. We've already had one particular student who has shown a wish to look at the data to do a further analysis on it with different statistical programs and all this. And to actually have a different research question and to measure other things as well. So of course, you're always limited with what you are actually measuring. The focus group.
Andriana, there's only about 10 minutes left. So I don't know, do you want to go on to the recommendations? Or because I don't think you're going to have time to have a look at the impact and...
10 minutes for me, but
yeah.
You are just including the question time.
No, 10 minutes.
Okay.
La la.
And I thought it would, and I was telling Maronia, this is too much. Kemm ngħid. Okay, so yes, so basically you can read all of this in the reports. These were some of the things that we looked at. So knowledge about violence, changes in attitudes, discussion on violence, disclosure of violence, and basically they show more insight into what were the results of the surveys. So these are some quotes. I enjoyed the session with the lawyers most, as we didn't know about certain legislation. I asked them a lot of questions. The trainer actually said that they previously thought that domestic violence is just about hitting, but we went into issues of equality, sexual consent, and they learned a lot about that. I think this is a young woman, a young female. I think that they touched upon everything because it was not just about domestic violence. They used about dating, emotional and psychological violence. Changes. One of the trainers actually said that they saw certain perspectives that the girls had before and after the project. For example, a boyfriend who constantly sends messages. Before they saw it as something nice, but after they came to speak to me and told me it's not always nice, they started realizing that certain things they experience, it could be a sign of control, and so they started realizing about the warning signs. Most of them talked a lot about these warning signs. I think I learned more about respect and trust. Before I used to tolerate certain things, but now I know I should not tolerate them, and I started speaking up more. So I would be more comfortable taking action. This is an adult. Discussions on violence. Every group always mentioned it's not just women who are victims of violence. Men are also victims of violence. Men have a double barrier because the attitudes, the toxic masculinity and the hyper masculinity actually leads them not to report because they will be ridiculed by their friends, etc. One boy actually said this, and it was very significant. I used to think that boys are always the tough ones, but they aren't always the tough ones, as they have feelings too, and they should be allowed to let their guard down. So this was a young man, a youth who participated in the training, talking about this pressure that boys feel to be macho. About school, and then this was a team as well. I don't trust the system. Because I believe that when you use the system, you'll get more in trouble. When I am reporting someone, if there isn't the action as it should be, it's going to become even more dangerous. And this was something that was also seen throughout. Some disclosures of violence that happened in the training. And this was something related to process. Should the groups have been separated? Should they have been together? Boys and girls, there was a lot of actual positive feedback to the fact that they were boys and girls together because they could listen to the boys' perspective, etc. So this was something that we were looked at. And one of the biggest important thing that start where the participants are. Okay, so very important that even if you have a plan, even if you have all these things prepared, you have to be flexible and you start where they are. And we had a huge variety. They will talk to you more about them. And we had some women in prison, for example, who did this training. So we had a huge variety of women and young people who obviously had a complete different experience. So in terms of impact, this is the conclusion. The findings show that in general, adults became better informed of the various facets of violence and what services are available. Participants reported exposure to violence rose by 20%, so disclosure rose a lot. And this could be due to a more nuanced knowledge of the topic, so they acknowledged the different forms of violence that they were not previously aware of. They thought it was just hitting, and then they realized, Lalu, I experienced that, I experienced this, that is violence.
In terms of attitude, there was a slight positive change in 15 out of the 23 statements, but only a minority were statistically significant. Changes in the propensity to intervene, we saw that as well. There was a reluctance to report and a general mistrust in authorities and in the system. And another reason for negative responses, as we said, now this is interesting, there was a degree of reluctance and defensiveness among the participants, especially among the adults. And it was reported by the trainers and even in the focus group. So why are you doing this training to me? You know, why especially, they're already vulnerable, they're already in vulnerable groups. So why am I being targeted for this training? And there was a bit of that kind of resistance. Especially when it comes to, for example, migrant women who sometimes come from a culture that is already stereotyped. So they would go all out to say, in my culture, you know, you think that in my culture there's a lot of violence, but it's not true. So don't come here, you Maltese, trying to show me what is, you know. So there was a bit of that resistance. But then I think it was overcome by the end session. Yes, so again, this is the impact with young people, both in terms of knowledge, changes, though less when it comes to behavior. The leaders that participated in the focus group noted a number of changes in the behavior of their groups following the training, especially related to reduction in gender-based teasing. There was one, I can remember him, a leader from one group who has mixed boys and girls in the Scouts. He said before, they used to go, like if a girl is in a mood or something, they would say, mela ġikil period, yo, the PMS, and following the training, he told me, we noticed that teasing stopped. You know, and if they say a joke, the girls will say, touch the chajta egg, that's not appropriate. So there was this change that the leaders actually noted long term. And even the youth participants themselves actually said that now they are more likely to challenge sexist remarks and to take action when they do that. Some, I'll skip this because it's also a summary, some additional findings that were not about change, but I think they are very, very important to even analyze further. Most of the young people beliefs about masculinity, femininity, and gender roles were generally positive, even pre-training, while younger children are more likely to adhere to traditional gender stereotypes. So children are the most conservative, it seems, but then as they grow older, maybe they become more exposed, or they are more honest when completing the questionnaire as well. Problematic beliefs were noted in relation to gender roles in romantic relationships, male and female sexuality, and adherence to rape myths. So the ones we saw in the Eurobarometer, we saw, and I was a bit shocked about this because these were young people, most of them. They were between 14 and 20. So they believed things like, not sexy clothes. Nobody believed that sexy clothes cause rape. But if she is drunk, she is partly responsible for that behavior. Also, men sometimes do not intend to rape, but they cannot control their sexual urges. And this was a belief. Another belief that the young people had, about half of them, and not a small group, was, the statement was, it is okay for a woman to have more than one sexual partner. And you had half who disagreed. But again, they're young, so probably that is because reflecting as well, if you're 14, 15, your moral code is a bit stricter, you know, in that regard. So that could change as they grow older. For adults, there seems to have been more engagement and active involvement by the participants in the respective organization following the training. This was reported by the trainers. So they said they became actually more involved with us after the training. There is a considerable reluctance to report violence, and out of all services, respondents are least likely to report to the police. So there is a general huge mistrust of the police, and even elaborated on in the focus groups. the representatives of the organizations themselves became further aware about the wider barriers and increased vulnerability that their particular target groups experienced, especially in relations to accessing services and breaking cultural taboos on violence. For example, services for disabled women. How does a disabled woman go to the police station and report if there are certain difficulties even in accessing the services? With migrant women, again, the cultural taboos in relation to breaking the silence. So recommendations, this is recommendations for our research, so it's a bit selfish. Standardize the training so we can test its impact, but although we did this recommendation, we understand that flexibility is important. Focus training now on the more problematic issues. For example, teen dating violence and sexual assault for young people, rather than maybe including a wide range of topics that make it more difficult than to achieve and assess impact. So let's focus on the things that matter, that are problematic. Not everything matters, but if something is problematic, let's focus on it. Following the analysis of results drawn from adults group and from children is that training in such groups should be better targeted in the sense that we target, again, the topics that are problematic. And the prevention literature now is rife with the example to show the importance of follow-up programs. Okay, so even the participants mentioned that it should be ongoing, and we concur with this perspective. You can't just have one training and then send people off to live their lives. There needs to be ongoing follow-up programs and ongoing training. So recommendations for advocacy, very, very short. Demand institutions we can trust. Share with a person of trust. So if you're going through something, intervene wisely. Okay, so intervene in a way that is suitable. Focus on changing stereotypes related to sexual violence. Focus on parents to change the message, the messages that are given to children. So these were our ultimate recommendations in terms of advocacy or campaigns. Thank you so much for bearing with me especially, and for being very patient and keeping your focus and attention for such a long time. I don't know if there are any questions or comments. I know now we're keen to have our teas and coffee. Yes. It's better if I don't give you this one, because it's full of germs.
Your last remarks got me thinking, because we are always doing a lot of awareness raising and working with the education department with regard to gender equality and how children are educated in that respect. And yet we find that young people, more than the older people, are less aware of equality between the genders than the older. What is interesting also is what you said, that now, at the end, that older people, adults, should be careful on what messages they are sending to the younger ones. But apparently that isn't working either, because the older people are more aware, and yet it's not coming down to the younger generations. So this is more food for thought. What are we going to do about this? Because when we talk to the education department and we work with them on projects, they're always telling us they're working very hard on this issue, and yet the results are not there. So yes, this is very provocative, not only from the issue, because obviously gender equality and violence against women is a very close issue. It's very patriarchal, and we need to think more about it and understand what is happening there.
I think it's because it's much more than awareness. Throughout the past 20 years, it's all been awareness, awareness, awareness. But awareness does not necessarily change behavior.
No.
And I think that is where now we need to put our money where, where our mouth is, and try to focus on changing behavior, which is much more difficult to do. And of course, it needs to be supported by all the institutions. There's no point in going to school and learning about, equality, and then going, I don't know, to going home, and you see your mother coming from work at 6 o'clock and doing all the housework, and your father sitting on the sofa watching television, you know? So ultimately, that is going to be absorbed more.
Is about educating TV presenters, the media in general. But recently, I've been interviewed by a man on television, and I was shocked. I wasn't prepared for the sheer insensitivity he expressed towards the whole topic, the whole subject. And he has a program that goes live. And so people actually watch this and listen to him. He denied patriarchy, for example, doesn't exist. And he asked me, what do you mean? Should we have a matriarchal society? Instead, he said, come on. You know, is this for real? And when I mentioned how what being a woman feels like when you go for interviews, for example, he said he denied that women are treated differently during interviews, even though I shared a personal anecdote. Because when I once went for an interview, and it was made up of a male panel, and they asked me, does your husband know you're here? Does he know you've applied for this job? Who will take care of your children should you get chosen? I was shocked then, and when I cited this to the presenter, he dismissed it as if I was lying, for example. I didn't feel validated at that moment, and he said that even he gets harassed on the street as a man.
By a woman?
I wanted, believe me, I wanted to go into it, but I decided not to, because it would get ugly on TV, and I didn't want to be embroiled in all that. So I just expressed my skepticism. I think I expressed it non-verbally, a little verbally as well, but there's a limit to what you can do. And I was angry at the fact that this guy is allowed to broadcast his, fascist ideas without anyone, without immunity, yes. So I think this is very important. People listen to TV presenters, they listen to radio presenters. Some people have the TV switched on all day. You know, I think this is very important.
I mean, the messages are everywhere, not just TV, it's everywhere. From top to bottom, from everywhere you go, in families, in education, in our court of law, on the media. So we have to target all of these institutions and call out. For example, the new NGO or initiative on media that Professor Brenda Murphy started was calling out newspapers when they say the wife of, I don't know, or whatever titles and whatever insensitive things, or when you see, you know, a press conference on education, which is mostly a women-led profession, and it's all men, and you don't see one woman. And of course, when you call out, you're going to get resistance. And they're going to tell you, now you're going to speak about this, it's COVID. No, it's COVID. No, nothing. You can't speak
and
about
we're a
gender
small country as well.
It's COVID.
So it seems that we're beginning to get some ideas of what the next strategy is going to be. And Katja was just saying that the current strategy around domestic violence and gender-based violence is coming to its end. So this research, as well as some of your recent experiences and connecting in with maybe some of the other commissions here in Malta, are giving the ideas as to what's needed for the next phase, and to embed some of the work that has come out from the recommendations of this research, as well as the other work that has been done in terms of the current strategy. I'm just going to take a break now, if that's all right. I know Andriana is leaving, but perhaps you can stay for a cup of coffee.
Stay for a coffee break.
Great, and if anybody, I mean, in particular to pick up the research report, because there's so much detail in that, I think that would answer any particular questions. But as Andriana said as well, of course, to contact them in the university if there's anything you want to follow through with, which I think would be really important to as you said, to continue with the work, so that you don't just have a block of work and then nothing happens. So it's about finding what's the pathway then to continue. But anyway, Andreana, thank you so much for